good evening and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. It's going to be something to do with the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I'm going to play this one by ear because I've got information for you, but I want to make it cool and dynamic. So let's just see what happens. Underneath the south pylon of the Sydney Harbour Bridge is a place called Dawes Point. It bookmarks the Rocks Ferry Terminal, which is the original landing site of the First Fleet back in 1788. Now a small green space, it used to be a fortification for the early British colonists in the 19th century. Being situated next to the Rocks Ferry Terminal, that original landing site in 1788, the geographical landscape of Dawes Point actually sticks out further than the rest of the coastline section at Port Jackson. So it was quite strategic in its positioning as a fortification. You could see any oncoming ships either attacking you, or trying to at least, or any incoming import ships that were delivering goods or convicts to the colony. Lieutenant William Dawes arrived with the First Fleet in 1788 and built a small observatory on this peninsula, which was at that time called Tara. And about a year later, he built a small storage facility for the gunpowder magazines. On December the 18th, 1791, Lieutenant William Dawes left the Australian coastline, and soon thereafter a fortification was properly built on the site and the peninsula renamed Dawes Point. Over the next 70-odd years, the fort would remain largely unchanged, save for a redesign and a modernisation in 1819 by Francis Greenway and Governor Lachlan Macquarie. Now, with the onset of the Crimean War in the early 1850s, Dawes Point fortification became a command post in a series of fortifications that were built along the coastline, which included Bennelong Point, where the Sydney Opera House is, Mrs Macquarie's Chair, where a nice little viewing platform is, Fort Denison, and Kirribilli. But following the threat of the Russians and the Crimean War, Dawes Point slowly became a more and more redundant area and a redundant fortification. In 1870, the British forces in Australia withdrew. In 1900, the area was more of a park space and a residence for the Commandant of the Armed Forces. And in the 1920s, before the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the fortification was completely demolished and the cannons were taken away. Now, the cannons that you see in the clips that I have shown you are the original cannons from the 1850s that were returned back to Dawes Point in 1945. And in the 1970s, Dawes Point was actually saved from development and urbanisation by a group of enthusiastic historians who would save it for heritage and the cultural memory of the early chapters of the Botany Bay colony. So apparently what a fun and dynamic video is doing a little bit of context, then having no idea what to do next, sitting on the information for 8 months, and then finally getting round to doing it. Before creating this little bit, let's just get on with the video. There had always been a sort of discussion about creating a bridge going across the Sydney Harbour. Discussions started to begin in about the 1840s and rumbled on throughout the rest of the 19th century, never really materialising into any concrete plan. The closest plan came actually in 1900, but then was scrapped some 3 years later because the bridge designs were not quite up to standard. Also, there was quite an efficient ferry system that went between Miller's Point and Milson's Point, stretching across the harbour, that transported around 40,000 people every year. And as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There didn't need to necessarily be a bridge if this ferry system was working quite well. But in 1922, after many years of discussion, the New South Wales government decided to put forward legislation allowing for the construction of a proper bridge going across the Sydney Harbour. Following the passing of this legislation, the New South Wales government opened up a sort of competition, if you like, asking various companies from across the world to send in their ideas and architectural plans for a bridge going across the Sydney Harbour. On January the 1st, 1924, the lines closed, and there were 20 companies, as I say, from across the world that submitted their ideas for a bridge. This was then shortlisted to about 6 different plans, until finally a company from Middlesbrough in England, known as Dorman, Long and Company, finally got the rights to build what is now known as the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And the company quoted that this large Sydney Harbour Bridge would take between 7 and 8 years at a cost of £4.2 million. Now, only one of those things actually became the truth and came to fruition. And I'll give you a guess as to which one it was. Although this English company had been given the rights to construct the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1924, construction had sort of already begun in late July 1923, as an opening ceremony known as breaking the first sod was dug out of the ground. And between July 1923 and March 1925, the groundwork was cleared and readied for the construction of these new pylons. This included demolishing up to 500 private and commercial buildings around the Dawes Point area and its adjacent side. On the 26th of March 1925, the New South Wales Governor, Sir Dudley de Chair, laid the first foundation stone into the Dawes Point pylon. So proper construction of these 50-metre pylons could now be underway. The first 5 years of construction were, well, relatively easy in the grand scheme of things. There were no major catastrophes, setbacks, or even delays. The famous archway that goes across the harbour itself was started from both points in 1928, were at near completion by mid-1930, so just 2 years to construct what is a nearly 1,200-metre stretch of bridge. But a change within society, not just within Australia, but across the world as well, would change the dynamic and the purpose of the Sydney Harbour Bridge forever. In the mid to late 1920s, the world was going through an era known as the Roaring Twenties, a period of post-war positivity, happiness, economic growth, where everything was Art Deco and we were all dancing to jazz. But then in 1929, the Wall Street crash happened. And during the early 1930s, we entered a period known as the Great Depression, a worldwide economic downturn, which was the complete opposite of what had been felt in the previous 5 years. Everyone was miserable, everything was a bit grey, unemployment was high, economies slowed, and productivity was very, very low. In Australia, unemployment stood at 1/3 of the entire population. But the Sydney Harbour Bridge saved the economy. The Harbour Bridge was referred to colloquially as the iron lung that kept the Sydney economy breathing. It employed, at the height of its construction in 1930, some 1,400 construction workers. And there were many other hundreds of jobs that were indirectly sort of part of the forces that would create the Sydney Harbour Bridge, from the manufacturers of the carbon steel that would go to making the giant arch, from the brick makers making the bricks for the giant pylons, even some of the service industry, because obviously construction workers need to eat and need somewhere to stay. In late July of 1930, the 2 major arches that make up this great bridge had completed their construction phase. Some 550,000 pieces of carbon and silicon steel, held together with 6 million rivets and weighing a grand total of 53,000 tons. All that was left to do was to connect these two sides of the bridge to create that continuous arch that we so know across Sydney Harbour. Now, the gap between these two arches stood at only 1 metre apart. So, in a moment of frivolous ceremony, shall we say, the director of construction, a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Ennis, decided he was going to take a wooden plank up to the top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, lay it across the two overarching pieces and walk across, marking himself as the first person to cross the Sydney Harbour Bridge to get to the other side. Ennis crossed the bridge on the 7th of August 1930, and the next day he and the other crane construction workers began the 11-day process connecting these two parts of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But there were a number of issues and reasons why it took 11 days just to fill that 1 metre gap. The first issue that was occurring was the weather. In that first week trying to connect the bridge, there were a number of windstorms that battered and swayed the bridge to a point where, well, it was unsafe to actually try and get a perfect connection. But thanks to 4 massive 300-ton hinges that account for the weight and stress that the bridge faces every day, as well as accounting for the movement experienced by tumultuous weather like windstorms, the Sydney Harbour Bridge managed to hold up. And so about a week later, on the 19th of August 1930, the bridge was finally able to be connected. But it was a very long day. At 11 a.m. on the 19th of August 1930, the 365 cables that also hold together this massive length of a bridge began to be loosened off, so that over a 5-hour period, that 1 metre gap slowly started to shrink, and then eventually at 4:15 in the afternoon, they came together. But then a new problem occurred, because it was now turning towards the hours of sunset, and the heat was starting to slowly rise. And the problem with metal is that it has a tendency to contract and to expand in extreme conditions of temperature. Well, any temperature really. And so actually this connection was rather not very synced up and wasn't safe to be properly riveted in. After another 6 hours waiting for the temperature to decrease to a point of 16.5 degrees Celsius, as well as a process of loosening and tightening the cables to get that perfect synced up connection, at 10 p.m. in the evening, the final process was complete. The arches came together and the Sydney Harbour Bridge was complete. The final piece to constructing this major project across the Sydney Harbour was the actual bridge part of the bridge. The road deck that would accommodate all of the vehicles and automobiles, all of the trains, because there was a train line initially, and of course all of the pedestrians that would cross from one side of Sydney to the other every single day. The process of creating this road deck occurred during the entirety of the year 1931, before being weight tested in the February of 1932. During the testing of February 1932, the weight capacity that had been quoted by Dorman, Long and Company was, well, pretty spot on. 160 trains, 40,000 pedestrians and 12,000 vehicles could cross the Sydney Harbour Bridge every single hour, and the bridge would still stand. On the 19th of March 1932, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was officially opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a 2-kilometre procession that went across the Sydney Harbour Bridge and of course the edges beyond that. Thousands of individuals lined the streets of Sydney to mark this spectacle, this ceremonial occasion. All the misery and the grey dullness of the Great Depression were forgotten about in these moments. People from all walks of life came from across Sydney and across the entirety of the Australian continent to be a part of this ceremonial occasion opening the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And it was an event that was covered by numerous publications and newspapers from across the world. In a rather disgruntled moment throughout this joyful ceremony, the former paramilitary army officer F. de Groot decided that he was going to cut the opening ceremony ribbon with his official sword, which was not planned, rather too early, and it wasn't even supposed to be him that was doing it. He was fined £5 for his transgressions and actually marks a sort of folklorish moment of the Sydney Harbour Bridge history. In the immediate years following the completion and the ceremony of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Great Depression and the economic downturn that was felt as a result was starting to ease, and the economy was on the rise. Despite the fact that the Sydney Harbour Bridge actually cost roughly 2.5 times more than the original quoted price, at £10 million. And in the decades that followed this completion and ceremony, the Sydney Harbour Bridge went from being a local landmark of industrial integrity and maturity, economic stability, to being a national landmark that brings in thousands, hundreds of thousands of tourists every year, and even those that wish to climb the very top of the arch. I hope that over the course of this video you can understand that the Sydney Harbour Bridge is more than just a landmark that someone has pulled out of a hat and decided to make one of the many faces of Australian tourism. The other two, of course, being these ones. I hope that you can understand that the bridge is not just something to cross a body of water. It is something that helped people in a time of need, gave people a sense of pride in being Australian. A bridge that serves a purpose, but also as a reminder to that grey, bygone era that Australia pulled through with great success. Thank you for watching this video, and I shall see you in the next one. See you later.